Ghana. This is a peaceful war. It's not a demonstration.
Someone may be trying to start a war in West Africa, a war that will potentially drag in Russia and NATO.
In the heart of Africa, a dangerous game is unfolding. A silent chessboard stretching across deserts, jungles, and fragile borders. A story that begins with whispers of rebellion in Mali, spreads through the corridors of power in Ghana, and threatens to ignite a conflict that could drag in Russia, NATO, and the entire world. The warning didn't come from a government or a military leader. It came from one man, an investigative journalist, David Hundeyin. His shocking revelation? That someone, somewhere, is trying to start a war in West Africa. A war born not of ideology, but manipulation. A war designed to fracture the fragile alliances that hold this region together. This is the story of an invisible battle, a battle for Africa's soul. Welcome to Win Africa, where we uncover the truths they don't want you to know and bring you the stories that shape our continent's future. In July 2023, Niger's skies thundered with revolution. A military coup swept across the nation, tearing down an old order and declaring a new era.
The meeting took place at the palace after General Abdurrahman Chiani, head of the Presidential Guard since 2011, was declared the country's new leader, replacing former President Mohamed Bazoum.
But Niger was not alone. To its west, Mali had already endured years of insurgency and foreign intervention. To its south, Burkina Faso, led by the fiery young Captain Ibrahim Traoré, had risen against neo-colonial control. Together, they formed something unprecedented, the Alliance of Sahelian States, an alliance born of desperation and defiance. United not by wealth, but by shared struggle against Western influence, they turned to unlikely partners, Russia, Turkey, even North Korea, seeking security and survival. In this new axis, a line was drawn. On one side stood the Sahelian Alliance. On the other, Western-aligned nations like Nigeria, Benin, and Côte d'Ivoire, and caught in the middle, Ghana. For decades, Ghana has been a sanctuary amid the chaos of West Africa. A nation often praised for its peaceful transfers of power, its vibrant democracy, and its steady hand in a region defined by turbulence. But in the aftermath of the Sahelian coups, even Ghana's stability would be tested. When John Mahama returned to power, he inherited more than a presidency. He inherited a fractured region, two opposing forces staring each other down across invisible lines on a map.
Among others. So you had these guys on one hand, and then at the other end of the ideological spectrum in West Africa, you had the likes of Nigeria, Benin, and Côte d'Ivoire, which were and are very much Western aligned. And sitting at the physical and metaphorical center of this tinderbox is Ghana. Now in January, Ghana's new president, John Mahama, embarked on a diplomatic charm offensive. You might recall when these images went viral as Ibrahim Traoré visited Ghana for Mahama's presidential inauguration. Since then, the Ghanaian port of Temba has become a key port for the landlocked Sahelian alliance. And Mahama has deepened that partnership while still maintaining close diplomatic partnership between Ghana and its Western-aligned neighbors like Nigeria.
In January, the world watched as Mahama stood on the steps of Accra's Parliament House, greeting visiting dignitaries during his inauguration. Among them was a figure whose presence would spark whispers across the continent, Captain Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso. Young, defiant, and adored by those who saw him as a modern revolutionary, Traoré's handshake with Mahama was more than diplomatic courtesy. To some, it symbolized unity, a rare moment where rival blocs could find common ground. To others, it was a warning, a sign that Ghana, the West's trusted ally, might be sliding toward the Sahelian orbit. Social media erupted. Photos of the handshake went viral, dissected, and debated in newsrooms from Abuja to Paris. In that single gesture, Ghana's delicate balancing act was laid bare for the world to see. Months later, Mahama's policies deepened this perception. The Ghanaian port city of Temba transformed into a critical artery of commerce. a lifeline for landlocked Sahelian states cut off from traditional trade routes. Cargo bound for Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso now passed through Ghanaian docks, escorted under heightened security and heavy scrutiny. This economic partnership was pragmatic, even necessary, but it also raised alarm bells among Ghana's western-leaning neighbors. Nigeria and Côte d'Ivoire watched closely, wary that Ghana's new role as mediator could erode their influence. Mahama's challenge was immense. Keep the Sahelian alliance close enough to prevent war, but distant enough to reassure the West. Preserve Ghana's role as the region's diplomatic glue, even as the forces pulling it apart grew stronger by the day. But glue, no matter how strong, can only hold under so much pressure. By mid-2024, cracks began to appear, not on the surface, but deep within the quiet corridors of diplomacy. Cracks that would soon be widened by lies, propaganda, and a single tweet that nearly set the region ablaze. July 2024. The sun rose over the red sands of northern Mali, where a convoy of soldiers wound its way through desolate terrain. An uneasy alliance of Malian troops and Russian Wagner contractors, bound together by a fragile pact of survival. By nightfall, the desert had swallowed them. Out of nowhere, the silence shattered. An ambush, fast, surgical, merciless. In less than an hour, 47 Malian soldiers lay dead. 84 Russian contractors followed. The attackers melted back into the dunes, leaving behind twisted metal, blood, and questions. A claim that shocked the world. Days later, an extraordinary announcement emerged. Ukraine claimed responsibility. It was a stunning declaration.
Mali says it is immediately cutting diplomatic ties with Ukraine. It comes over comments by a spokesperson for Ukraine's military intelligence agency about fighting in Mali's north that killed Malian soldiers and Wagner fighters in late July.
For the first time, the war in Eastern Europe had spilled into Africa. Kyiv framed it as part of their global campaign against Russian influence, a strike against Moscow's growing footprint in the Sahel. But for Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso, this was no longer about Russia. This was about sovereignty, about outsiders turning their homeland into a chessboard for distant wars. The alliance of Sahelian states severed what few ties they had with Ukraine and stormed the United Nations with accusations of foreign meddling. Their message was clear: West Africa would not be another proxy battleground. For a brief moment, it seemed the crisis might subside. But like dry tinder waiting for a spark, the region remained primed for fire. By mid-2025, tensions were paper-thin. Trade routes were militarized, borders patrolled, rumors of espionage spreading like wildfire. Then it came, a single tweet, posted by Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. A short message, a bold claim. Ghana, he alleged, had signed secret military agreements with Ukraine, purchasing combat drones and inviting Ukrainian troops to guard its northern frontier. The accusation landed like a bombshell. Within hours, headlines erupted across African and international media.
As borders. For context, Ghana has a northern border with Burkina Faso that stretches over 600 kilometers. So if you're the Sahelian alliance and you've cut off all diplomatic ties with Ukraine because they helped terrorists murder 47 of your soldiers, how would you interpret a neighboring country you share 600 kilometers with, agreeing to import Ukrainian drones and troops, and then to protect its borders? From who exactly? You see where this is going. Well, it turned out that Zelensky made the whole thing up. There was no such agreement. While he did have a private telephone conversation with John Mahama, he thoroughly mischaracterized it on Twitter. And he did so very publicly in a way that was calculated to create the maximum possible diplomatic friction between Ghana and its Sahelian neighbors.
The Sahelian alliance accused Ghana of betrayal. Crowds took to the streets in Ouagadougou and Niamey, burning Ghanaian flags and calling Mahama a puppet of the West. In Accra, the government scrambled to deny the claims. There were no secret deals. No drones, no foreign soldiers, but the damage was already done. What followed wasn't fought on battlefields, but in whispers, tweets, and clandestine meetings. A shadow war, misinformation weaponized to turn brother against brother. In this new conflict, truth was no longer the first casualty. It was the battlefield itself. Diplomatic corridors were already on fire. Accusations, denials, and threats flooded the airwaves. But the real battlefield wasn't in parliaments or presidential palaces. It was online.
While he did have a private telephone conversation with John Mahama, he thoroughly mischaracterized it on Twitter. And he did so very publicly in a way that was calculated to create the maximum possible diplomatic friction between Ghana and its Sahelian neighbors. In fact, a number of news platforms even erroneously picked up the false story. But that wasn't all. Almost concurrently as this was happening, a video started making the rounds across Ghanaian social media, depicting a Nigerian man declaring a plan to create a Nigerian ethnic kingdom inside Ghana. And while this was happening, an obviously inorganic hashtag, Nigeria must go, which was being pushed by a network of bot accounts, also began doing the rounds. And in fact, this botnet began promoting a purported public demonstration to demand the expulsion of Nigerians from Ghana.
In the early hours of a humid August night, a grainy clip began circulating across Ghanaian social media. The man in the video, his face shadowed, voice trembling with anger, declared plans to create a Nigerian ethnic kingdom inside Ghana. The message was incendiary, echoing long-standing fears of foreign domination and ethnic friction. Within hours, hashtags erupted. Nigeria must go. Protect Ghana. Street protests followed. Politicians scrambled to respond. Newsrooms ran the video on repeat, feeding a frenzy that spread far beyond Ghana's borders. But then came the first clue that something was wrong. Digital forensic analysts traced the first wave of posts. What they found was chilling. The outrage wasn't real, at least not at first. Tens of thousands of accounts, faceless, nameless, posting in perfect unison, had pushed the video into virality. The accounts weren't Ghanaian. They weren't Nigerian. They were no one. A coordinated digital army, engineered to inflame tensions between two nations already standing on the edge of crisis.
Some accounts within this botnet even attempted to inflame tensions further by them pretending to be Nigerians calling for a military invasion of Ghana. Thankfully, Ghana's foreign minister waded in and doused the controversy, revealing that the video making the rounds was an old video recorded in 2013. Exactly how this video was stripped of all its identifying context and repurposed into viral fuel for a clearly inauthentic online political action campaign remains unclear.
The deeper investigators dug, the darker it became. The video wasn't new. It wasn't even recent. It was recorded over a decade earlier, 2013, during a forgotten local dispute. Stripped of context, weaponized, and unleashed at the perfect moment to exploit old wounds. By the time the truth emerged, the lie had already sunk its claws into reality. As digital fury boiled over, real-world violence followed. In Abuja, Ghana's diplomat was found murdered, the body left as a warning. Days later, the Ghanaian ambassador's residence was ransacked in what officials first dismissed as a burglary. But the timing was too precise. The symbolism, too deliberate. Was it coincidence? Or a carefully scripted escalation? The invisible war had entered a new phase. No longer just nations versus nations, but truth versus manipulation, memory versus myth. And in this chaos, one question loomed larger than ever. Who was pulling the strings? The pattern was impossible to ignore. First came the diplomatic lies, then the artificial outrage, botnets, old videos, coordinated disinformation campaigns, and finally, targeted violence. This wasn't coincidence. This was orchestration. But the question remained, to what end? In a region defined by fragile alliances and shifting loyalties, Ghana stood apart. For decades, it had been the bridge, trusted by both the revolutionary Sahelian bloc and the Western-aligned coastal states. When tempers flared, Ghana mediated. When borders tensed, Ghana negotiated. Remove Ghana from the equation, and the entire West African balance collapses. The Sahelian alliance would lose its vital trade artery, the ports and corridors feeding their landlocked economies. Western-aligned states like Nigeria and Côte d'Ivoire would lose their only neutral partner, plunging diplomatic channels into silence. And in the vacuum left behind, chaos would thrive. Who gains from chaos in West Africa? Arms dealers who profit when borders bleed. Foreign powers eager to redraw influence maps, exploiting war to install proxy regimes. Shadow actors seeking to drag Russia and NATO into a new battleground. Another Cold War played out on African soil. Destabilizing Ghana isn't just an attack on one country. It's an attack on the fragile architecture holding half a continent together. For the people of West Africa, the cost would be staggering. Refugee flows spilling across borders. Ethnic tensions reignited. Famine creeping into already fragile regions. The return of foreign troops, not as peacekeepers, but as players in a wider game.
Now, these could all be random, unconnected, unfortunate events that so happen to take place within 11 days of each other in July 2025, but that would explain why someone paid for a social media bot campaign that tried to create international tension in what is West Africa's oasis of stability. And why did Mr. Zelensky so publicly try to pit Ghana against its Sahelian neighbors? To what end? Because if you're a third party trying to start a war in West Africa, this is pretty much exactly how we'd go about it. You'd go after the country that is a trusted trading partner and diplomatic ally of both the eastern-leaning Sahel and western-leaning Nigeria, and you would try to isolate and destabilize it by creating multiple diplomatic disputes with these allies, so that in the resulting leadership vacuum with that country out of the way, fireworks could then begin to fly.
History had seen this pattern before, from the Congo crisis of the 1960s to the wars of Sierra Leone and Liberia in the 1990s. When global powers meddled, ordinary Africans paid the price, and now, the script seemed to be repeating. As the invisible hands pushed Ghana closer to the edge, one chilling question lingered. Was this the opening move in West Africa's next great war? Amid the chaos, amid the bots and bloodshed, voices began to rise. Not the voices of foreign diplomats or international organizations, but voices born of African soil itself. In Ouagadougou, Burkina Faso's young leader Ibrahim Traoré stood before a sea of his people. His words were blunt, almost incendiary. "We will not bow to any empire. Our destiny is ours to write." For Traoré, this wasn't just politics. It was survival. Burkina Faso had endured decades of exploitation, coups, insurgencies, and the silent theft of its resources. Now, he was determined to break the cycle, even if it meant standing against the world. To his supporters, Traoré was a hero. To his enemies, a dangerous radical. But to everyone watching, one thing was clear. He was a symbol of a new African defiance. Far from the battlefields, Kenyan scholar and activist PLO Lumumba echoed that same defiance, but in a different register.
The extraordinary political change in Burkina Faso, the extraordinary political change in Niger, the extraordinary political change in Mali, in Gabon, and the Malabo Protocol says that unconstitutional changes of government are not desirable. Whose constitution?
The chains of colonialism may have fallen, he warned. But new chains, invisible and digital, bind us still. Lumumba's speeches became rallying cries across the continent. In lecture halls and on social media, he dissected the subtle mechanics of neo-colonial control, economic dependence, debt traps, disinformation, urging Africans to reclaim not just their lands, but their minds. And then there was David Hundeyin, the journalist who first sounded the alarm. Operating in exile, often on the move, Hundeyin pieced together fragments of a puzzle few dared to see. Botnets in Ghana, foreign weapons in Mali, mysterious money trails flowing through shell companies in Dubai and Cyprus. His investigations carried a price: censorship, threats, attempts to silence him. But he persisted, believing the truth itself was a weapon. Together, these voices, a soldier, a scholar, a journalist, converged on a single warning. Africa must wake up, because the war for its future is already here. A war fought not just with guns and drones, but with lies, manipulated outrage, and digital chaos. This is not merely a clash of armies. It is a battle for the soul of a continent. Beads. West Africa stands at the brink. One spark, one tweet, could ignite the powder keg. David Hundeyin's revelation is not prophecy. It is alarm. A call to look closer, question deeper, and remember that in geopolitics, nothing is ever what it seems. Because somewhere in the shadows, someone is still trying to start a war. This story is still unfolding, and the world is watching. What do you think? Is West Africa on the brink of war, or can diplomacy still save it? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. And if you found this story important, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so more people can understand what's really at stake.